There are moments in medicine that stop the world. Moments when everything that was once considered settled, final, and beyond question is suddenly turned upside down by something no one saw coming. For 34 years, the medical community held one truth about Abby and Brittany Hensel as absolute and unchangeable, that they would live their entire lives joined together, sharing one body, navigating the world as two minds in one physical form. Doctors had studied them, examined their anatomy in extraordinary detail, and reached a consensus that was never seriously challenged. Separation was not possible. The risks were too great. The shared organs, the merged spinal nerves, the deeply intertwined systems, all of it made surgery not just unlikely, but medically unthinkable. And then the unthinkable happened. When news emerged that Abby and Brittany had undergone a separation procedure, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People who had followed their story for years struggled to process it. Medical professionals who had long studied their case found themselves reconsidering everything they believed about the limits of modern surgery. The public, which had watched these two women grow up through documentaries, television appearances, and news coverage, suddenly found themselves asking a question no one had seriously entertained before. What does life look like for Abby and Brittany now, on the other side of something that was never supposed to happen? That is the story we are going to tell today. Not just the story of a surgery, but the story of two women stepping into an entirely new version of their lives, facing challenges that no rehabilitation textbook has ever fully addressed, rebuilding their identities, their routines, and their relationship with each other in ways that the rest of the world is only beginning to understand. This is the story of what comes after the impossible. Before you can understand what life looks like for Abby and Brittany after separation, you need to understand what their shared life actually involved at a biological and daily level. Because the word conjoin can sound simple, but the reality of how their bodies were arranged was anything but simple. Abby and Brittany were born as dicephalous parapagus twins. This is one of the rarest forms of conjoined twinning ever documented in medical history. The condition means two fully developed heads on a single torso, two brains, two personalities, two distinct individuals sharing a physical structure that the world was not designed to accommodate. Their case was studied in medical schools not as a curiosity, but as a genuine example of how the human body can develop in extraordinary ways and still maintain function. From the chest upward, they were separate in meaningful ways. Each had her own heart, her own set of lungs functioning within a shared chest cavity, her own stomach, and her own nervous system controlling her respective side of the body. Abby controlled the right arm and the right leg. Brittany controlled the left arm and the left leg. Walking, therefore, required both brains to agree simultaneously, every single step, without deliberate thought, through a coordination so deeply embedded that it became invisible to observers after years of watching them move through the world. From the chest downward, the sharing became much more profound. They shared one liver, one set of intestines, one bladder, one reproductive system, and one pelvis. Their two spinal cords, which began as separate structures at the neck, gradually converged as they moved downward, eventually merging into a single nerve network in the lower body. That network controlled leg movement, bladder function, bowel function, and the structural stability of their entire lower frame. This is why, for decades, separation was considered medically impossible. The liver alone presented enormous risk because of the complexity of its blood supply. The pelvis presented a structural challenge unlike almost anything else in surgical history. The merged spinal nerves meant that any attempt to cut or separate in that region risked permanent paralysis for one or both of them. And the shared reproductive system meant that even if surgeons could navigate everything else, they would still face the challenge of rebuilding two complete biological systems where only one had existed before. These were not abstract concerns. These were concrete, measurable, documented reasons why surgical teams looked at their case year after year and arrived at the same conclusion. Leave them as they are. The risk of surgery vastly outweighs any potential benefit, particularly because they were living full, healthy, active lives. They worked as school teachers. They drove a car. They traveled. They had friends and family and a life that, while deeply unusual by ordinary standards, was genuinely thriving. And yet, medicine moved forward. Technology advanced. Robotic surgical tools became capable of precision that human hands cannot match. Artificial intelligence began mapping nerve pathways with a level of detail that transformed what surgeons could see before making a single incision. Imaging technology allowed the internal landscape of even the most complex anatomies to be understood in 3 dimensions, in real time, with a clarity that simply did not exist a generation earlier. Slowly, the impossible began to look merely extraordinarily difficult. And extraordinarily difficult, for the right team with the right technology and enough time to plan, is a different thing entirely. The decision to pursue separation surgery was not made quickly, and it was not made by anyone other than Abby and Brittany themselves. That point is important and worth sitting with for a moment. Throughout their lives, one of the quiet frustrations they occasionally expressed was the tendency of the outside world to speak about them as though decisions about their bodies belonged to everyone. Medical commentators, journalists, curious strangers, and well-meaning members of the public all had opinions about what they should or should not do. What was interesting was that Abby and Brittany, throughout all of that noise, consistently demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to live on their own terms. So when they began seriously exploring the possibility of separation in their 30s, it came from a place of long deliberation, extensive consultation, and deeply personal motivation. Both women were entering new chapters of their lives. Abby had married. Brittany was developing her own distinct personal and professional interests. The shape of their individual identities had been growing clearer for years, and with that clarity came a natural desire to explore what full physical independence might mean. The conversations they had with surgical teams spanned years, not months. Medical advances had reached a point where surgeons were willing to reconsider what had previously been dismissed outright. New mapping technologies could now trace their nerve networks with enough precision to identify pathways that might be separated with manageable risk. Robotic tools could reach areas and perform maneuvers that open surgical approaches never could. And a new generation of reconstructive techniques meant that building 2 functional lower bodies from one shared structure, while still extraordinarily complex, had moved from the realm of fantasy into the realm of careful, planned possibility. The risks remained enormous. No one pretended otherwise. Cardiac events during surgery were a real concern. Nerve damage was a real concern. The possibility of loss of function, of mobility, of bladder control, of a dozen other things that most people never have to think about. All of it was laid out clearly and honestly in the consultations that preceded the operation. Abby and Brittany understood every risk. They weighed it. They discussed it between themselves in the way that only 2 people who have shared a body for 34 years can truly discuss something. And they chose to move forward. That choice deserves respect, not analysis from the outside. It was theirs to make. The operation was unlike almost anything previously attempted in surgical medicine. The team assembled for it was not a single specialty group, but a collection of experts drawn from neurosurgery, vascular surgery, orthopedic reconstruction, organ transplant medicine, anesthesiology, and rehabilitation medicine. Each specialist was responsible for a specific phase of the procedure, and coordination between them had to be seamless because the margin for error was nearly zero. Robotic surgical tools handled the most delicate portions of the work, particularly in the areas involving blood vessels and nerve bundles. Artificial intelligence mapping systems guided the team through the architecture of their shared lower spinal network, identifying which pathways could be safely divided and which required preservation at all costs. The operation proceeded in stages rather than as one continuous effort, allowing the team to stabilize each system before moving to the next challenge. The liver division was among the most technically demanding portions of the procedure. The liver is a highly vascular organ, meaning it carries enormous amounts of blood through a dense network of vessels. Dividing it cleanly while maintaining adequate function for both has required precision that pushed even experienced surgeons to the edge of their capabilities. Synthetic support materials helped reinforce areas where natural tissue alone was not sufficient to sustain the reconstruction. The spinal work was the most tension-filled phase of the entire operation. Their merged nerve network in the pelvic region had controlled mobility, bladder function, and structural balance for their entire lives. Surgeons worked slowly and methodically, checking nerve response signals continuously as they separated what could be separated and preserved what could not be disturbed. Monitoring equipment tracked brain activity and muscle response in real time throughout this phase, with any change in signal immediately prompting a pause and reassessment. There was a crisis. During the procedure, Abby's heart rhythm became dangerously unstable and briefly stopped. Cardiac specialists responded immediately, restoring her heartbeat while the rest of the team maintained stability for Brittany. It was a moment that reminded everyone in that operating room exactly how much was at stake and how little room existed between success and catastrophe. Her heart returned to normal rhythm, and the operation continued. When it was over, 2 surgical tables held 2 separate patients for the first time in their lives. Vital signs were monitored with extraordinary intensity. Independent circulation, independent breathing, independent nerve responses, all confirmed that both bodies were sustaining themselves. The surgery had succeeded, but success in the operating room was only the beginning of an entirely new kind of challenge. The recovery period that followed the surgery tested Abby and Brittany in ways that even the most thorough preparation could not fully anticipate. Their muscles, which had spent 34 years coordinating movement between 2 connected systems, now had to learn an entirely different language of motion. Their nervous systems, which had adapted over decades to sharing control of a single lower body, now had to recalibrate for individual function. The first weeks were humbling for 2 women who had, against all reasonable expectation, lived remarkably active and independent lives. Neither could sit up without assistance. Lifting an arm required conscious effort. Turning the head felt unfamiliar. The body that each of them now occupied alone felt, in the words of their rehabilitation team, genuinely foreign to them. This is not a small thing. Imagine spending 34 years knowing, at a level deeper than conscious thought, exactly where your physical edges are, and then waking up to discover that everything you knew about your own body has fundamentally changed overnight. The psychological dimension of recovery was, in some respects, more complex than the physical one. For their entire lives, Abby and Brittany had never experienced a moment of genuine physical solitude. There was always the warmth and presence of another person, another heartbeat, another breathing rhythm beside them. Not beside them in the way that a roommate is beside you, but beside them in the most intimate physical sense imaginable. Now, for the first time, there was space. Actual, physical space between them. And that space, rather than feeling like freedom in those early weeks, felt like loss. Their rehabilitation team recognized this and addressed it thoughtfully. Mirrors were placed in their recovery rooms so that each woman could see a familiar face when she looked up, providing a small but psychologically meaningful anchor to the sense of self they had always known. Familiar sounds and routines from their shared life were recreated in the hospital environment to reduce the disorienting quality of the new situation. Therapists worked not just on physical recovery, but on helping both women process the emotional reality of a change that had no real precedent in human experience. After 6 weeks of separate recovery, Abby and Brittany were allowed to meet in person. It was the first time they had seen each other as truly separate individuals, standing apart, occupying their own physical space. The moment was quiet. They reached toward each other and held hands. For 2 people who had never needed to reach out to find each other before, that gesture carried a weight that words struggled to carry. Physical therapy intensified after that meeting. They practiced sitting without support, then standing with braces, then taking careful steps. Every aspect of movement that had once been negotiated between 2 nervous systems now had to be relearned as a solo operation. Balance, which had previously been a constant collaborative achievement, now had to be rebuilt from the ground up for each of them individually. Progress was slow. It was sometimes painful. It was also, week by week, undeniable. By the end of their first year of recovery, both Abby and Brittany had reached the point of independent walking. It was not the fluid, practiced movement that had characterized their shared life for decades, but it was genuine, self-supported, individual movement. Medical staff who had been present throughout the recovery process described watching them walk across a room independently as one of the most remarkable things they had witnessed in their careers. What does daily life look like now? It is a question that Abby and Brittany have chosen, wisely and understandably, to answer largely on their own terms, and in their own time. They have always been thoughtful about the boundary between sharing their story, which they have done with genuine generosity over the years, and protecting their personal privacy, which they have also consistently insisted upon. What we do know is that the texture of their daily lives has changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Abby, who had married Josh Bowling in 2021 while they were still joined, is now navigating what it means to share a home and a life with a husband in a configuration that looks far more conventional than anything she had previously experienced, while still maintaining the deep and irreplaceable connection with her sister that defines both of them. The marriage, which had always involved a kind of triangulation that required extraordinary emotional maturity from everyone involved, has now shifted into something that requires a different kind of navigation entirely. Brittany, who had been quietly developing a stronger and more confident individual identity in the years before the surgery, has found in her recovered physical independence a new kind of canvas. Her interest in medicine, science, and advocacy for families affected by rare conditions has deepened. Her friendship with Ryan, which developed through shared intellectual interests and a mutual respect that treated her as a complete individual person rather than one half of a famous pair, has continued to grow. She has spoken carefully and thoughtfully about the experience of inhabiting her own body for the first time, describing it as both disorienting and quietly exhilarating, like learning a language you always knew you were meant to speak, but had never had the chance to practice. Both women have spoken about the strange gift of being able to make physical choices that are entirely their own. Something as simple as choosing how to sit, which direction to face, when to stand up and walk. These are experiences that carry a significance for them that most people will never be able to fully appreciate. For 34 years, every physical action required negotiation, cooperation, and mutual agreement. Now, each of them can simply decide. The simplicity of that is, for both of them, something they are still learning to absorb. Their relationship with each other has also entered a new phase. The bond between them is, by every account, undiminished, but its character has changed. They are no longer two minds in one body, working through every moment of every day in the closest possible physical proximity. They are now two women who share an experience so singular that no other human beings alive can fully understand it, maintaining a closeness that is now chosen and sought rather than structurally inevitable. They call each other. They visit. They make plans together. They are, in the truest sense, sisters. Sisters with a history that sets them apart from every other pair of sisters who has ever lived, but sisters nonetheless. Abby and Brittany Hensel have never asked to be symbols. They have, throughout their lives, consistently expressed a preference for being understood as people, two ordinary women living in extraordinary situation, rather than as representatives of anything larger than themselves. That preference deserves to be honored, and yet it is impossible to tell their story without acknowledging that what they have lived, and what they have now survived and moved through, carries meaning that extends beyond their own lives. Their story is a story about what human beings are capable of adapting to, the coordination they develop from infancy, the instinctive and seamless collaboration between two brains controlling one body, is a demonstration of neurological flexibility that continues to interest scientists and researchers decades after it was first documented. The fact that they lived healthy, active, professionally engaged lives for 34 years in a configuration that medicine had every reason to expect would be limiting speaks to something profound about human resilience. Their decision to pursue separation and the surgical achievement that followed also represents a meaningful milestone in medical history. The technology, the teamwork, the planning, and the execution that made the operation possible reflect decades of accumulated progress across multiple fields of medicine. Robotic surgery, AI-assisted nerve mapping, advanced reconstructive techniques, improved understanding of shared anatomy in conjoined twins. All of it converged in a procedure that would have been genuinely unimaginable even 20 years ago. Future medical teams working with other conjoined twins will study what was learned from Abby and Brittany's case. Families who receive diagnoses today that feel hopeless may one day benefit from knowledge that was earned in that operating room. Perhaps most importantly, their story is a story about identity, about what it means to be a person, to have a self, to maintain individuality under conditions that seemed designed to dissolve it. Abby and Brittany never stopped being two distinct people with different tastes, different strengths, different emotional responses, and different dreams. That distinctness survived 34 years of shared physical existence. It survived the surgery. It survived the recovery. It is surviving the strange and unprecedented experience of building two separate lives from what was once one shared life. That persistence of self, that refusal of the individual spirit to be erased by circumstance, is something genuinely worth paying attention to. Abby and Brittany Hensel are still writing their story. The chapter that has just ended, the one that began at birth and concluded on a surgical table after 34 years, was extraordinary by any measure. But the chapters ahead, the ones being written now in two separate homes, two separate bodies, two separate daily lives that remain bound together by something stronger than shared anatomy, may turn out to be the most remarkable ones of all. They did not ask for the life they were given. They did not choose the condition they were born with, the attention that followed them, the medical debates that surrounded them, or the surgical risk they eventually faced. But they have, consistently and with remarkable grace, chosen how to meet every one of those things. They have chosen openness when they could have chosen silence. They have chosen cooperation when conflict would have been understandable. They have chosen growth when stagnation would have been easier. And now, on the other side of something no one thought possible, they are choosing, one careful step at a time, to move forward. That is what their new lives look like. Not a miracle, exactly, or not only a miracle. Mostly, it looks like two people doing the hard, unglamorous, deeply human work of figuring out who they are and how to live. The same work, in the end, that the rest of us are doing too. Just with a story behind them that none of us will ever fully understand, and a courage that all of us can recognize.